Society, you're a crazy breed. I hope you're not lonely without me. Thanks for listening to my cover of Eddie Vedder's Society. It's a great song. Sorry if I just ruined it for you. Today we shall be talking about and reviewing The Sibling Society by Robert Bly. I heard it mentioned in a podcast conversation interview and looked into it because I thought that it was interesting, because I've had that thought before. Why is everybody so emotionally infantile in our culture? So I also didn't know who Robert Bly was. I always like expanding about knowing who came before. It was published in 1996, so almost 30 years ago, and very different world. We are not even really living in the same world that it was in 1996. But some of the things are still very spot on. I think he had his finger on the pulse on something. I'm going to be honest. I know he's a poet and he's very loved for all the people who really appreciate poetry. I have not entered into a poetry zone, but I've just never explored or dove really into that, aside from Mary Oliver and aside from kind of more well-known poets. But he was a poet, a prose man, a storyteller. He was very into myth and very deep. His range was very wide. Then some of the things that you could tell he really put stock in and believed, I was like, I couldn't, I wasn't on the same page, so to speak. You know, some of the evolution stuff, the Darwinism stuff, and also he was very Freudian, and I'm not a big fan of Freud. I think Freud and all of his psychoanalytic theories, I think he was a twisted pervert. And I don't know that I would go to any of Freud's theories or findings about what he said about human nature and development and all of that, the psyche. I don't know that I would ever let that inform my thoughts about what I am, who I am, how I developed, unconscious processes, ego, like the whole thing. Okay, so what does he mean by the Sibling Society? It's a metaphor to describe a modern culture where traditional hierarchical structures, hierarchical, it's a very hard word for me to say, and mature role models have lost credibility, leading individuals to relate to each other as peers rather than as mentors or mentees, or having people that you look up to. In this society, adults regress toward adolescence, and adolescents have little desire to become adults, resulting in a culture that glorifies youth, constant youthfulness, rejects the process of maturing, and lacks genuine earned authority. This shift stems from the erosion of fatherly authority, the destruction of intergenerational connections, and the replacement of deep vertical relationships with superficial horizontal peer interactions. So I like what he brought up about that, the vertical and horizontal, right? The vertical had to do with higher things. They kind of take you out of this very human material plane, whereas the horizontal is just your material realm, your interactions with people here. Tossing out the vertical realm completely shut off something very deep and important about life and the reality, the nature of reality. And in the 90s especially, that was definitely happening. I think now, because people feel that void, especially in the last 15 years, that's why neo-paganism and all of the occultic and all of the esoteric stuff is just like swarming in. I understand, it was interesting because I understand his critique. I feel really, really in agreement and sad at the loss of like the elder system, that's just kind of not in our culture anymore. You know, I feel like it's very nice to have this kind of initiatory seasonal process of a human life where you start out as a baby, then you go to a toddler, then you're a child, then you're an adolescent, and then you're initiated into an adult, and then after so much adulthood, you're an elder, and there should be wisdom there, and and the elder system has just been wiped out, and the reverence for the insights that older people have is just something that it's just not really around that much. The generation gap is so big, and then there's like another angle where I understand why young people don't have necessarily reverence for what came before, because what came before in all of those entrenched power structures, those hierarchies, I don't think hierarchy is bad. I think that what's happened with people in power being completely satanic and void of a love for actual human nature and morality, and very corrupted, I think that's what's been at the top of the hierarchy. If people at the top of the hierarchy were good leaders that had a sense of humility, that they live under God, it's very different what would be happening. You know, how do you respect the generations that have produced world wars and totally obliterated and damaged and trashed our world and created so much chaos? And that's still happening, right? So we're living in the right through a whole other paradigm shift, a whole other era. So it's still going on, and the world that's been built for a lot of young people is not a good one. That's the whole thing. Being an adult should be very, very appealing. It should be, you know, something to be excited about. You enter in this. That was my dog. I don't know if you heard this. Being a mature person should be an honor. Like, the nobility of being an adult is just gone, because now everybody's super self-centered, and all the characteristics of being a mature human are just kind of like, what even are they? Also, I think that when we think about a lot of behavior coming from the boomer generation, which would be kind of if things developed normally with like an aging hierarchy, the boomers would be the people that we really looked up to, and that whole generation produced some pretty interesting adults. The boomers, I'm not sure how much we respect them. They just got sucked into the empire. And I give them leeway because they got psyoped a lot. They had a lot of things that morphed and shaped them towards being that way. So adulthood, getting clear on adulthood and maturity. Since people of all ages are making decisions to avoid the difficulties of maturity, I think that's also why a lot of people don't want children, like the dinks couples, and also the rugged individualism, especially that the American identity encompasses. Civilized behavior demands repression and restraint, and people don't want to do that. They want to just do and express whatever they want to do and express. with no thinking about anything else other than that release. He brought up that juveniles at one point knew how to preserve what had nurtured them. So, you know, you're coming into, let's just say in this culture, you turn 18 and you feel like you had many good things that helped you that you need to preserve and then pass on, which is another thing that, of course, Americans kind of haven't had because of all the technological shifts. People got lazy when it came to educating souls, and we got sucked into the machine. And for some time now, our own spark of life has often been more compelling, more important to us than the flame of the larger group. You know, you had all of these lone wolves. You know, it was much cooler to kind of do your own thing and to be a misfit out on the fringes, and you're the black sheep, and screw the tribe because the tribe's retarded and mean and doesn't understand, you know, very emo behavior. And listen, I from one angle, I get it. I left home at 16 and I moved to LA to be a movie star. So you know, it's not like I felt like I had an obligation to pass down traditions. Robert Bly was also really big with the men's movement. And I would much rather have someone like this leading, helping manhood and masculinity than people like Andrew Tate and all these weird modern people that are taking things the other way. So let's just really quick, just to see. I looked like what does being a mature person, what is maturity? The characteristics, the qualities. Taking responsibility for one's actions and admitting mistakes without blame shifting. That is something that is so rare. You know, taking accountability for the choices that you made that have gotten you to where you were. I understand we've been programmed, and a lot of people, because of said programming, made a lot of decisions. I am one of these people, right? Made a lot of decisions that assisted making really bad decisions that had consequences, that made it so I couldn't really focus on other people. I had to focus on getting myself out of the hole. But I also, and I'm not tooting my own horn, but I also am like, yeah, I made those decisions. Sure, maybe I was under a trance and a spell and following a culture that actually was like hostile to my spirit without realizing it. But I was like, I you know, got myself into that debt. I swiped card with money I didn't have. I chose to get involved with that dude that was clearly not invested in me. Yeah. So that is something that I have a few people in my life that there's just still, there's never a taking accountability for the decisions that they made that got them to where they are. And sometimes things happen to people's lives. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but for the most part, it's baked into life, reaping and sowing, reaping and sowing. Mature individuals maintain emotional control, reacting calmly under pressure and managing their emotions rather than being dominated by them. Everybody's dominated by their feelings. You can't have any conversation with anyone at this point without being like, but my feelings are what matter. My subjective perspective is the only thing that matters. And it's like, well, we all share a world. Objectivity really matters. And everybody's triggered, right? I was triggered, so that's a reason why I, behaved poorly. They demonstrate humility by recognizing their limitations, acknowledging the contribution of others, and not letting success inflate their self-image. Sound judgment and long-term thinking, the ability to delay gratification, which I think is becoming a thing, right? This no-buy movement, this backlash against constant consumerism, I think is helping people get back to long-term thinking, being wiser with spending and more intentional. That's all good. So I feel like that's something that's changing. Fulfill commitments, manage responsibilities reliably, and maintain integrity even when unobserved. So that's like a whole other thing. Commitments, making serious commitments, and then also making the sacrifices in order to keep those commitments without complaining, without whining. There's like whining over sacrificing as opposed to doing what needs to be done and not complaining about it. You know, I find a lot of feminists are actually really infantile because they have no control over their anger, their emotional life. There's high amounts of resentment and lashing out, kind of like a tantrum. And they, you know, they kind of view that as being powerful, empowered. It's not. Being composed is powerful. But then there's also all of these terms that keep coming out that, you know, people under the feminist ideology keep trying to put into our shared the discourse, I guess. Like the kin keeping. What was the kin keeping? Kin keeping is the act of maintaining and strengthening familial ties. It is a form of emotional labor done both out of a sense of obligation and because of emotional attachment. So that, I'm like reading that and I'm like, what an honor that that's the role, that that's the work that you have to do. What a purpose. Strengthening and maintaining deep relational ties. And feminists want to complain about it because what, you don't get paid money to do that, because it's exhausting, because like it's just wild to me that women think that complaining about that is not embarrassing. Like, that's embarrassing. I've completely gone away from the book. Okay, so back to the book. He also talks a lot about the fatherlessness issue, which is a very sad issue. And I agree with him that that's a problem. Sons who have a remote or absent father clearly can receive no modeling on how to deal appropriately with male anger. What it looks like, what it feels like, what it smells like, how to honor it or let it go, or speak it without hurting someone. Few sons now share a toolbox with a father. And, you know, daughters without proper masculine role models and that relationship, it does a lot of damage to them as well. So there's a chapter where it's called The Adventures of Ganesha. He goes into like a Hindu mythology. He says there's a little subsection called Receiving a New Head in Our Culture. And this kind of also tackles the identity. You know, especially when a young person goes out into the big world and their identity is really open, they don't have this very strong rootedness in knowing who they belong to, who they are, what they will or will not do, like a strong sense of self. That's just, and you know, you'll explore in your 20s, but I mean, I had no identity. And that only started to change at 32 when I understood who Jesus Christ was and started to come back to my relationship with God, because I found that any other time that I tried to put my identity attached to more worldly things, it was not stable. It was not anchoring. When a young man in our culture arrives at the end of adolescence, the river of secularity typically carries him over the waterfall and he's out into the big world. The speakers at the high school graduation will say the future belongs to you, but the speaker doesn't mention to whom the student belongs. He belongs to nothing. He belongs to the river. He belongs to the trash at the bottom of the waterfall. He belongs to the light beer he'll drink, you know, in college and all that. The sitcoms and bars and forgetting. He will find around him a group centered on the acquisitive instinct, by which I mean the impulse toward taking and consuming. So immediately then gets involved in status games, which is very empty. Sure, you'll have experiences, but you'll probably more often than not then enter into your 30s and be like, what is this all about? This is void. And take it from someone who opted out of the status game system. It's a journey in itself, not caring about achieving status. Of course, the advertising industry is utterly opposed to ending infantilism. They want you out of control and buying everything that your little heart desires. He brings up that our colleges and universities were becoming mere training grounds for corporations. Very true. They're indoctrination centers. I don't know why anyone's going to universities anymore. They are ideologically captured. Training grounds for corporations. They more and more resemble factories that turn out standardized parts. In this case, standardized human beings. That's why anytime you get in a conversation with someone who went to college, they all think the same. You're like, oh, okay. Then he starts, and he doesn't just talk about males and what's being done with the development of manhood. He also gets into how what's being done to young ladies, the protectiveness over young girls. The advertising forces would not want it to happen. Our culture, we could say, wants the girl after 5th grade or even before to be utterly absorbed by the desire to be attractive to boys. Which it's, you know, you've got teens in Gen Alpha obsessed with skincare, obsessed with buying products at Sephora to prevent their wrinkles. But what's crazy is now it's not even just like young girls trying to find a mate and be attracted to boys. It's also women even after they're married, after they've had babies, that need to stay provocative of sexual feelings, to be like the sexiest woman in the room. It's like, you're married and a mother of children. Why do you need to be the most bangable woman on the internet? I understand wanting to have a sense of style and to, you know, take care of yourself for longevity and just to kind of feel good in your skin. But we have so crossed a line where now the vanity that should be embarrassing and kind of like, wow, you think about how you look way too much and you spend way too much time looking in a mirror. The amount of energy exerted on trying to be hot. And when adult women are doing it so openly and being like, do what you need to do, girl, it's sending some pretty intense messages to younger girls that, you know, how you are, how God made you is not enough. You know, so that was a good question, how to protect young girls from the pressures of the junk culture. And also without it being like, you know, locked up in a prison, like you can't do anything. You've got to explain why junk culture is junk. So here's the issue. Adolescent girls today are experiencing much difficulty. Traditionally in the past, they've labored to adjust to their parents' values, but now most girls have a separate and more difficult task, adjusting to the jagged, frightening, half-insane values of junk culture. Obsession with popularity, demands for a thin body, for early sexual activity, and for early use of alcohol and drugs and so on. So that's the thing, like how sad that we don't share the same values as our parents, that our parents' values are not more intriguing and admirable, that people are feeling the need to like move away from that. Because here's something I highlighted. What the Sibling Society offers men and women in relationship instead of passion is the resemblance model. Men are to become more like women and women more like men. I find that a lot of people are kind of wanting to go back to traditional gender roles because there's something about them that kind of works if you pick the right mate. Now, if you don't pick the right mate, nothing's gonna work. Right, there's a chapter called Disdain and Contempt for Children in Sibling Society. Brain development not only requires a verbal bath made of adventurous words, grandmother and grandfather language, religious and philosophical terms, but also requires syntax, elaborate syntax. Elaborate syntax is itself a form of brain food. What is elaborate syntax? All right, I actually don't even know what syntax is. So here we go. What is syntax? In linguistics, is the study of how words and morphemes, there's another word, I don't know, morphemes, combine to form larger units such as phrases and sentences, focusing on the structure and rules governing their arrangement. I had to look up because in this book it mentioned higher order reasoning skills. And I was like, what exactly is that? Higher order reasoning skills are cognitive processes that go beyond simple recall of facts and basic comprehension of concepts. So I can do that. But these skills involve complex judgmental abilities such as critical thinking, problem solving, analysis, evaluation, synthesis, and creativity. They are considered more valuable than lower order thinking skills because they enable individuals to apply knowledge in novel situations, make informed decisions, and develop innovative solutions. So when you're thinking about what education should be teaching our kids, it's this kind of shit. I really loved the process of learning, and it's so sad that that's been so attacked and infiltrated, and that learning is like, ugh, I have to learn, this is so boring, or it's such bullshit. You know, like the history that's taught in schools is not worth knowing because you're just gonna have to go back and undo that. Then he gets into television and how it's deforming our minds, which I totally agree. I think people who watch too much news, deforming their mind. Children who watch too much, have too much screen time, completely throws off their development. It violates the natural slowness in which learning takes place. The speed is too great. The transformations may seem sophisticated to an adult or charmingly childlike, but the child's mind is left behind. It feels incomprehension and once more tunes out the meaning, even as it tunes in the entertainment. The habits of mind necessary to be a good reader, and then also a good thinker, are exactly what television does not teach. Language, active reflection, persistence, and internal control. He said free trade actually means that the transnational corporations have won their battle to make working people all over the world interchangeable. Yeah, so slavery is still alive and well. I love that he's like, we are all human beings now standing in the rubble of a destroyed, literate society, looking at the ruins of education, family, and child protection. And he wrote this in 1996. 1990, it was like, hold my beer. 30 years later, it's only all gotten worse. What's, the level below rubble? Rubble that's just been sitting there and has a bunch of weeds then crawling and encroaching on it, keeping it from being cleaned up and something better being rebuilt. I don't know. All right, here's another thing he brings up that I think also plays a huge factor. Psychedelics. What happened with Woodstock and then the 60s and then that whole, revolution. And then the huge psychedelic thing that happened just in the last, I want to say 10 years, but I feel like, has it been longer than that? When did Michael Pollan's book come out about psychedelics? Because that kind of like ushered it in. But he says, the psychedelics promised and temporarily at least delivered a mythological or cosmic world of which the elders knew nothing. Many 60s youth felt that they had gone far ahead of their parents. Elders were symbolically killed in the very taking of acid, done without any grasp of what that might mean. Native Americans felt horror that white people would take peyote with no elders present, no one to clear the air or protect the souls from invasions by those spirits who do not wish us well. Because there are spirits who do not wish us well. But I'm not sure how much protection witch doctors and shamans and people who don't have, I'm not sure how much they can protect your soul from being, having hostile spirits attached to you. Okay, my camera died. So where was I? I think I was talking about psychedelics and how, just how much all of these young people being like, I'm gonna do this, have this experience so I can learn something about the greater picture, about the nature of reality, all this stuff. And then you do it and you have this whole trip and you have all these epiphanies and realizations. Of course, then you're not gonna go to your grandparents and your parents or anyone older than you who has not had those experiences and be like, give me some of your wisdom. It's just, people feel like they've got it on their own, or they want another guru that's done a ton of psychedelics to tell them what to do. So the cost of you trying to shortcut yourself into some wisdom with some psychedelics and drugs versus allowing the wisdom to come just from life and living and lessons and mistakes, you know, is an interesting thing to think about, to ponder. I think that's what I was gonna say. I'm just a rambling gal at this point, so I'll wrap this up. Talks about the hostile being inside, which to me, when I read that, I'm like, yeah, that's our fallen nature. That's the sin aspect of us. How old are we before we realize that someone inside us doesn't wish us well? Now that's very true. There is something inside all of us that lives in the heart that if you do not put it in check, or I would say do not submit to the Lord, that thing will work against you. Naive people know nothing of the one inside who doesn't wish you well and think that their enemies are all in the outside world. So you do have to protect yourself and not wreck yourself. And do your best to not dance with the devil. I know it's tempting. I did it many times. And now when I look back, it makes me shiver when I think about it. Last thing he brings up is, that I highlighted here, cultures with depth have firm codes. These firm rules or codes or frameworks or commandments are there because they're loving, because they guide and they help, while the world can be quite chaotic. So making peace with certain rules, I would say not rules that come from the government, but rules that are coming from our lineage of being humans, and what's worked. All right, so I'm just gonna end this. This book, it was really important to people when it came out. I think it really meant a lot. He meant a lot to a lot of people. I appreciated aspects of it. I think he was a man who cared. But it wasn't my favorite book. I wasn't just like, oh. Like when I read Wendell Berry, I was just like, oh, I just melted. So that is the Sibling Society. And here's to hoping that we can have proper adults enter the room again and that make adulthood great again. That might piss people off, but whatever. Okay, bye.